All right, well, happy Friday. I hope everybody is doing well. For those of you I have not met, my name is Harry Kazianis, and I'm Senior Director here at the Center for the National Interest. I'm also lucky and privileged to be the Executive Editor of our publishing arm, the National Interest. We are, if you may know us from all of our web articles, our print journal that Jacob Halbren is Editor-in-Chief of the whole publication. We are actually the largest national security and foreign policy magazine and website in the world, something I'm privileged to be a part of. Today we have, I think, a real gem for you, a very, very well-timed session. I don't think we could have planned it any better with our very special guest, the 70th US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Before we introduce our guest, I just think it would be important to detail what our discussion is going to be all about today, the order of battle, if you will, and how we're going to tackle all of this. Just to set the scene a little bit. Now, clearly, the People's Republic of China is modernizing and expanding its nuclear weapons arsenal while showing off new hypersonic capabilities. Those are very much in the news that I think have the Biden administration very worried that they're going to be able to catch up. And it's a huge problem. It's been in the news quite a bit, and front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, until the Russia crisis, which we'll get to. It's funny, I can actually remember in grad school at Harvard talking about Chinese nuclear weapons as almost a mere afterthought in US strategic thinking. I remember one professor, I won't name them, he called them something to the effect relatively small, unthreatening, and really nothing to worry about. Well, in the last few years, that's changed quite a bit. Beijing is rapidly upgraded the sophistication of its ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as increasing their numbers exponentially. And we shouldn't forget, Chinese nuclear weapons can hit the United States homeland. And I think it was roughly about 20, 25 years ago where an unnamed Chinese official said something to the effect, would you really want to trade Taipei for Los Angeles? So pretty ominous in the nuclear warnings they were giving even all those years ago. But I think clearly that the nuclear weapons challenges the United States faces today don't stop with China. Russia, something I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about today in the next 45 minutes or so, is updating and upgrading its nuclear arsenal with all sorts of new delivery platforms. And in fact, this weekend, we might see some of those new delivery platforms as Russian President Vladimir Putin will actually oversee snap nuclear drills. There's been talk in the press about intercontinental ballistic missile tests. So that's something that we could see, showing off some of these new weapons platforms that the Putin regime, thanks to very hefty oil revenues, 10, 15 years ago, has invested that money in new nuclear weapons technologies. The Russians, for example, are also building new ballistic missile submarines that will house nuclear weapons. So the Russians are clearly modernizing just like the Chinese. But then there's other nuclear threats that we have to worry about. It's not just China and Russia. Obviously, North Korea is investing in intercontinental ballistic missiles, testing the Hwasong-14, the Hwasong-15, both in 2017, and then showing off a much heavier and bigger Hwasong-16 back in October of, I believe, 2021. So we have that challenge. And also, we cannot forget about Iran and Iran's potential breakout nuclear capabilities, and the Biden administration trying to negotiate to maybe scale back those capabilities and lead into another JCPOA agreement. So to deal with all of this mess, if you will, all these different critical challenges, America faces a lot of tough choices with its nuclear posture, with its ability to achieve and make sure that we have nuclear deterrence against all of these different foes and adversaries. And I think we're lucky. So few people I think are better suited to really answer a lot of these questions than our friend and colleague, the 70th Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's with us today. His remarks are actually inspired from a recent long-form piece in the National Interest, which you can find called Nuclear Weapons, China, and Strategic Defense Initiative for This Century, which is a great read. I highly recommend it. The Secretary, as you will, was the previous director of the Central Intelligence Agency from January 2017 to April 2018. Prior to that, he represented Kansas for many years in Congress. Somebody I followed quite a bit as a North Korea researcher, very interested in all of his meetings with Kim Jong-un and all of the nuclear diplomacy that happened with North Korea. So lots to cover. So with that, I will stop and I will hand this over to Secretary Pompeo. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to speak for maybe 5 to 10 minutes to just give a summary of the piece that I wrote and further sort of how I came to think about this during the 4 years that I served in the Trump administration. I first started thinking about this set of issues when I was a young cadet. Everybody's read Graham Allison's classic book on decision making in a crisis. When the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, that was probably the first time I was exposed to how one thinks about these complex strategic set of issues. And for the, whatever that is, I guess I'm getting old. For the ensuing 35, 37 years, I've been continually thinking about how the landscape has changed, how the facts on the ground have changed, and what that means for securing America from these most devastating threats. When I came to be CIA director, we were presented with a problem in North Korea that was a front burner proliferation set of problems, wholly separate from the flagstone idea of denuclearization. He was launching missiles and preparing to conduct further nuclear testing, and we wanted to slow down that progress as much as we could, both in ways overt and with all the other tools that the United States had. We also began to see the effects of the United States not having seriously thought about what you spoke to, Harry, which is the change in the Chinese trajectory with respect to their full onslaught of capabilities, commercial, diplomatic, space, but missiles and nuclear program in specific. We hadn't dealt with them in a serious way. The great summits, the great treaties on arms control had always been the United States and the Soviet Union, with China sitting back, not involved, not connected to that. The landscape was pretty clear. We had China conducting more missile tests every year than the rest of the world combined. We had Russia with an economy that was capable but struggling. And we had a Chinese Communist Party with the capacity to have an economy that rivaled the world, and a space program and an orbital delivery set of capabilities that were rising very, very quickly. So President Trump's direction to me was, let's go tackle Iran and tackle North Korea and the proliferation issues associated with that. But let's try and find an entente with the Russians that will encourage China to come inside of the historic deterrence posture that the two great superpowers had delivered for 25 plus years. We were unsuccessful at that. The Chinese Communist Party rebuffed every effort that we made, and even the, I'll call it at best, half-hearted efforts that Vladimir Putin made to convince Xi Jinping that he ought to become part of the deterrence structure. And so we were left trying to negotiate an arms control set of understandings in the midst of a US government that had grossly underfunded the resources needed to deliver true defense and deterrence. So that's all background for the piece that I wrote. And the piece that I wrote tried to present in a careful way the things that we could screw up and the Biden administration could screw up, and the things that were needed to do to affirmatively lay out a central understanding for American defense and American deterrence from nuclear capabilities over the course of the next decades. It starts with the central premise of the things one can get wrong. And we know that not too distant future, the Biden administration will release its nuclear posture review. And they've already hinted that they're going to, in my judgment, undermine some of the central understandings that are required for deterrence. They've hinted that whether they walk away from no first use doctrine or not, they will do so as a practical matter by claiming that these nuclear responses can only be in response to a nuclear weapon system, when in fact we can see that the risk of WMDs more broadly than just nuclear weapon systems need to be considered in terms of our capacity to use our nuclear arsenal. Happy to take questions about that. Second one's about money and strategy. They go together. We have significant programs where we got these old Minuteman IIIs. We have to continue building out a program that will replace the Minuteman IIIs on a timeline that makes sense to deter the Russians and the Chinese from thinking that they can have the advantage of only facing a nuclear dyad from the United States of America. I say that in the face of what's now, I didn't use the word in the paper, we had a section on it. It's really more than just three. When you now think about space, so we think about the triad, it's really a quadad, but we couldn't think of a good word that seemed a little awkward to us. But in the face of what is now a real risk that the strategic warning on which we have depended for so long could now be obliterated by an orbital system that can look and appear and feel like a satellite for an extended period of time, but then can be deployed rather quickly as a weapon system with fractional deployment at very high speed. This is something that we are literally unprepared to think about in a way to create a deterrence model against. I won't speak to the broad spectrum. Our defensive capabilities gets classified pretty quickly, but our capacity to deter our adversaries from continuing to deploy these weapons clearly has to be restructured and rethought. The Biden administration already made one misstep in my judgment. They renewed the New START treaty. It limits our ability significantly. It limits the Russians a little bit, and it limits the Chinese not at all. And we were holding out I call it a stick or a carrot. We were holding out renewal of that, which the Russians very much wanted. They asked us about it at every meeting, at every level. We were holding that out to convince them that they should encourage the Chinese to become part of this conversation. At the very least, we may not get them all the way home, but at least begin to talk about what it means to be a superpower with a super level power set of nuclear capabilities. The last thing I'll say on technical means capabilities is, we have an aging V-52 fleet that's due for re-engineering, and then we've got lots of subsea capabilities as well. We need our British partners in this. It won't just be the United States, and I'm happy to talk about other potential partners as well as potential risks. I think of India and Pakistan as being folks who understand the hegemonic intent of the Chinese Communist Party and whom we ought to make sure are part of the same strategic conversation as well. Which brings me to the last point, and this will get to sort of some of the issues of the day also. We saw the 5,000 word screed from the Russians and the Chinese at the opening of the Olympic Games. I think it suggests that they were putting up at least a happy front together. Whatever the scope and depth of that relationship will be, we should find ways to limit how closely they work together on these strategic issues. Russia is primarily European power. We lived under the Russia hoax for 2.5 years of our administration, and it defeated the mission set that I was hopeful I could help President Trump achieve, which was to continue to make them a more European power, to find places where the Russian people could work with the Europeans and the West in a way that was important and material and made lives better for the Russian people and created connectivity to the West in a way that I fear that we are impendingly losing. I got to know Vladimir Putin some. I patrolled the East German border when I was a young lieutenant. I am not naive about Russia and its desire to impact its near abroad and their ruthlessness and their willingness to do so. But it is not the case that they present the same nature of the threat that the Chinese Communist Party was. Xi's ambitions are hegemonic and global. Putin's more consistent with his own capabilities and frankly, Russian history as well. They reach out to the West an awful lot. We should find places where we can make that so and try to bring all of them inside of this set of nuclear understandings that can preserve deterrence in the way we've been successful doing these last decades. And so with that, Harry, I'm happy to stop there and talk about whatever's on everybody else's mind this morning.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those remarks. So with that, I think you know, sir, where I'm going to go. And we've gotten a lot of questions. I've had some questions texted to me, emailed. We have some questions that have alluded to into the chat box. So with that, I think it's probably best we start talking about Russia. I think the most important thing that, a lot of maybe people who are sort of generally interested in foreign policy, they see, Mr. Secretary, these headlines about Russia potentially invading Ukraine. We had the headlines just very, very recently that Russia is going to invade Ukraine on Wednesday. So a lot out there, and I think it's important to try to make sense of it. I think the easiest question to ask, and what's on everybody's mind, is what is Russia's goal in Ukraine in your mind?
In some ways, I think they've already achieved part of their goal. All right, one of Putin's central theses is to the extent he can disconnect Europe from the United States and European countries from each other. I think you've used that all to the good, and you've seen that fractured nature, certainly the fractured nature inside of Europe, where those who are most physically and kinetically connected to Russia take a line that is very different than Germany and France. So I think check the box one. I think Putin thinks the continued pressure, essentially, what I think about is the encirclement of Ukraine has driven that first objective. That first objective is connected to the way he thinks about the world, right? It's a little trite now, but very true. He does believe that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a calamity, right? The worst one of the 20th century. I considered it as a small part of it. I was a platoon leader in Germany. I consider it one of the greatest achievements of my life. He has the reverse or the inverse view of that. And so it is the case, whether it's in Georgia or in Central Asia, what we saw, Russian involvement in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, what they did in Kazakhstan. We've forgotten just a handful of weeks ago, Russia deployed troops to Kazakhstan, peacekeepers to Kazakhstan. This is all part and parcel of Putin's effort to secure and control his near abroad. Look, we shouldn't be foolish. That's something that the next leader of Russia is going to want to do as well, right? Threats on your border are serious business, but it is also the case that it is equally foolish to acknowledge that Putin's claim to feel threatened by NATO or threatened by Ukraine is largely nonsensical. I think most of the world knows. She certainly knows it too. The West has no intention of crossing the Western Russian border. And so when he raises this threat, his concerns, and even the extended threat that says he raises concerns about, ill treatment of Russians in Ukraine, right, this is silly on its face. The worst treatment of Russians actually happens inside of his own country. And so to think that he's trying to protect the human rights of the Russian people and the ethnic rights of the Russian people in Ukraine is just it's a great storyline. And frankly, you see on the right in America and on the progressive left in America, you say it works. It gets a little bit of a foothold. So I think those are the objectives of Putin. I think he's going to continue with those objectives. And the United States has a capacity and a deep interest in pushing back against his achievement of each of those objectives. We tried to do it in our administration, and we did it with some success, but this is a continued threat and will require continued American attention.
Fair enough. What do you think, Mr. Secretary, if Putin does go in, obviously he has a lot of options on the table. Do you think, for example, sir, would he go in with a full invasion to try and conquer the country? There's reports that are just breaking that now Putin has 190,000 troops on the border. How far do you think, sir, he's prepared to go?
It's impossible to know. I certainly saw material during my time in service that suggested that they had a full range of options about how they were thinking about these various issues, not just there. Don't forget, we've got armored vehicles nose to nose in Syria with the Russians. They have a warm water port in the Mediterranean. This is not. We have Russian folks in working in Venezuela and in Cuba. Right? We should be mindful that this isn't a single theater, and the theater is certainly not limited to kinetic warfare either. And so when you get asked, well, how far is he prepared to go? It's hard to answer just, well, here's the line that I think he won't drive a BMP past, or he'll shoot artillery no further than X kilometers inside of Ukraine. He's constrained in a couple of ways, made easier by $95 a barrel oil, but still real economic challenges for his government. Second, one thing, as the United States knows well, it's one thing to go take down a regime. It's another thing to occupy and control. Russian history in Afghanistan and elsewhere suggests they're aware of that problem as well, especially against a nation like Ukraine that has demonstrated the people's desire not to be under their yoke. So there will be not only resistance in the immediate, should he roll, that is, the Ukrainians will bloody the Russians. I don't have any doubt about the fact that they will, in a material way, do their best to push back and fight. They will bloody the Russians' nose. But the fight's not over. The day that they raise the flag that they choose to raise from the newly crowned government in Kyiv, should they choose to do that, that will continue for days and weeks and months. And Putin knows that and knows the cost, not just the monetary cost, but the cost associated with that as well. It will bleed them for sure. And so I think that suggests something. I think that suggests something smaller. If you can, I always think if you're a bad guy and you can get control without the cost, you probably will. And the ability to control the Kerch Strait, the Sea of Azov, the movement and the physical capacity to move product in and out of the port in Mariupol and in Odessa, those are real physical accomplishments that Putin could achieve with far less cost than trying to move into further west and further south into Ukraine. It doesn't mean he won't take that risk, but it seems as I weigh the risks, probably less likely.
No, that makes sense. So potentially lots of options for Putin, maybe a short, sharp war, maybe something bigger. And your point is well taken. There are a lot of points of interaction between the United States and Russia. Obviously, US fighter jets and Russian fighter jets, bombers, surveillance aircraft, all interacting in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic. So lots of points of escalation that make this, I think, very dangerous. Let me ask you a little bit deeper question when it comes to Russia. Now, I'm 42. I was an undergrad back in the 1990s when there was a lot of hope that Russia could be reintegrated or integrated into the West. And it seems like, Mr. Secretary, we're dealing with a much bigger, more fundamental problem. I want to get your take on. It seems like for really hundreds of years, Russia's been really wrestling with what is its place in the world? What is its place in history? Is it a European country? Is it an Asian country? If you recall back in the early 2010s, there was this talk about a Russian pivot to Asia, or is its own civilization? And I'm always taken by the fact that there's always these calls that have said, you know, in the early 1990s, we could have done much more to integrate Russia into the West. You know, there's always this hope to compare to when Germany was destroyed during World War II, the end of Imperial Japan, how those societies and civilizations, if you will, were brought into the West in different iterations. So in your view, was there more that could have been done? Is this a crisis that could have been averted in your view?
I wrote this at least tangentially in this piece, in the piece I wrote in the National Interest. I actually think that's a true statement. I think there was more. It's difficult. By the way, for those of us who were engaged in the Cold War, right? Some of us, it's hard to get past. And by the way, they don't make it easy, right? So they're in that sense, they're their own worst enemy. I'm only an amateur Russian historian for sure, but you can go back, and each time there's this effort. They do something, right? They do something. They go kill somebody in Skripal, right? I mean, they just or they engage in a way. They move the fence line in Georgia or in Abkhazia, right? They just and so there's a little bit this is trust. The United States hasn't done its part adequately either. Some of the language that gets used from time to time, it's one thing to say that you think Vladimir Putin has his set of interests, and you know he's a former KGB guy. He would always joke. He'd say, "Mike, you always call me a former KGB guy. You were the director of the CIA." Right? And so fair enough. What we should do is make clear that the Russian people have a real vested interest in being part of the West, being part of Europe, and that there are many leaders inside of Russia who are simply exhausted with the constant chatter. Contrast them with the leaders, the oligarchs, many of whom benefit enormously from Russia having this unique place in the constellation of nations in the world, where they're able to have a set of relationships that far outstrip the, whatever it is, 15th largest economies in the world, 15th largest economy in the world's capacity. So it is a mixed bag. It means the West needs to try. You know, the Germans would always, remind us that they were trying with things like, gas and the like. And what you have to make sure one does along the way is that the political comes along with the economic. It can't be the case that you can give Russia all the economic benefits without demanding that they make the political gestures connected to becoming part of the West as well. So my paper talks about they should be back inside the G construct, G6, G15, G49, right? We should invite them to be part of these structures, but it has to be the case that they are meaningful participants there. And to the extent they choose not to do that, it is pressure, not courtesy, that's going to get them to come back and want to be part of that. The last thing to say there is, and I've had the chance to talk to Dr. Kissinger about this. Right, he goes to China to make sure that the Chinese don't connect with Russia. The world has changed in the intervening 50 years. the challenge that we're all concerned about remains the same, right? A consortium between the Chinese and the peoples are very different. Their objectives are very different. Their short-range missiles land in different places, right? Just don't forget that thousands of kilometers of border between those two nations, highly depopulated on the Russian side, massively populated on the Chinese side. I promise you, whatever Putin is signing with Xi or whenever he's meeting with him, he is looking out of the other eye saying, I think I'm going to be the junior partner in this rodeo. And I'm going to be the sidecar to his mission. And this causes him too to understand that if he can find that foothold with the West, I think even Vladimir Putin would appreciate that opportunity.
No, I agree 100%. I'm going to ask you one last final question on Russia, I promise. Jacob Hogren, our editor-in-chief of the National Interest, just came out with a question, and he puts it very simply and bluntly, as he likes to do. Mr. Secretary, do you consider Vladimir Putin a shrewd or a reckless leader overall?
Very shrewd, very capable. I have enormous respect for him. I've been criticized for saying that. No, I have enormous respect for him. He was also an interlocutor that was always well-informed and deeply clear about what Russian interests were. I appreciated that. It required the same from us, from me, from my team. We had to be equally prepared and equally protective of the interests that matter to the United States. He is very savvy, very shrewd. I never saw, that's not quite true. When I think about some of the things they do in the diplomatic space and some of the things they do in this space where they go off people, I think that's counterproductive. I shared that with him very directly. I said, you're trying to find a way to connect with us. I think those things just make it really hard for Western leaders to engage with you because it lights up all the human rights issues and the like. And I just don't think there's much game in it. And he would smile at me with a look that reminded me that's a tough world out there. And no, I consider him a elegantly sophisticated counterpart, and one who is not reckless, but has always done the math. And we may disagree with his priorities, we may disagree with his math. We certainly disagree that the interests that he seeks are reasonable for his country in many cases, but we should never underestimate that he is doing this in a way where he's exhibiting his capacity to control and his deep desire that his most important objective, and I should have listed this first, his most important objective is that he continues to run the deal. Right. First and foremost, he is about power for himself, making sure that his place as the leader of Russia continues.
I think that makes sense. Let me bring in another question here from Christian Witten, who's a senior fellow with us at the center. He's very, very popular in media. He's very prolific in a lot of these issues. He asked the question, isn't it inevitable that we will have to resume testing nuclear weapons at some point? Can we rely on the same technology standards that really since 1991 when we haven't tested a nuclear weapon? Is that something do you think, sir, is on the table?
I do. I think it is absolutely imperative that we're going to have to do that. Not only is the technology old, the systems themselves are pretty old. I won't say more here other than I do believe that there will be a time when it will be absolutely necessary, and that it may well be the case that we are past that time. I'll leave it at that. I've weighed in another setting, classified setting on this, but yes, it's a long time since we've done that, and we should do this in a way that is clear and transparent. That is, our expectations for others ought to be clear and transparent as well. But yes, I don't believe we can leave this lie for much longer, and have confidence in our systems, and more importantly, make sure that our adversaries have confidence that we have confidence in our systems.
Okay, fair enough. Let me turn to North Korea for a second, something you were obviously very heavily involved in. Obviously, President Trump had a very different approach than his predecessors. We had a major crisis in 2017 with the North Koreans testing all different types of missile platforms, testing what they said was a hydrogen bomb, ICBMs, flinging IRBMs over Japan. I mean, it went on and on. There's a lot of questions about what other things could be done with North Korea to bring them back in the fold, to try and restart negotiations. We have one question here asking, do you think it might be possible if the Biden administration, for example, were to maybe follow on with what the Trump administration did and offer high-level talks, maybe some sort of person-to-person talks to try and re-engage with Pyongyang and maybe create some sort of either a short-term deal or a long-term deal. What do you think about that?
It was a very unique administration, and that was important. That was important. I say that not as a throwaway line, but it was very important. It gave us this unique opportunity to have those high-level conversations with two leaders who could actually have a serious conversation. The reason for this was that the discussions, whether it's the agreed framework or the various deals that have been struck before, were all started at at junior levels and then continued to move up. It was very clear to me when I was a CI director, when I first met Chairman Kim, that there was only one guy, and the information was shared in a very tight group. It's true everywhere, but it's most true in North Korea. Maybe there's another that rivals us, but in North Korea for sure, Chairman Kim is the singular voice that can actually deliver some change in North Korean policy with respect to their nuclear systems and their missiles. And so it was imperative that we get straight to him. If we were going to have a chance to change the trajectory of North Korea, that we had to get to him, and we had to get him in a serious way and a senior way. So I got the first swing, but I wasn't the commander in chief. We needed to have the two leaders together. And we got it, a short-term outcome that was better than where we were, but we never got to where we ultimately hoped we would get. It will take, so long as you have the same model in North Korea, not just with Chairman Kim, but his successor too. It will have to be senior discussions at the most senior levels, laying out a framework for how we're going to manage this process. Second thing here, I felt like when I was with Chairman Kim, Xi Jinping was sitting across the table from me too. I was deeply aware that this was not a two-party conversation, no matter whether there were just two of us in the room, two parties in the room. In the end, Xi Jinping views North Korea as a strategic asset. He also views it with real risk. This gets to how one should approach the weapon systems in North Korea. The North Koreans are unconcerned about America's presence in South Korea on the peninsula. Deeply unconcerned about it. Xi Jinping would love to see us go. Right? I can't say much more than this, but suffice it to say, I believe that it is in North Korea's strategic interest that the U.S. forces remain in South Korea. Because if you ask what in Chairman Kim's what in his heart, he's not worried about a South Korean invasion. There's not a country that borders China today that doesn't have a border dispute. You see what's going on in Nepal, even as we speak. We saw multiples of people killed in India and the Himalayas from China. Every maritime boundary that the Chinese continue to demand. The North Koreans watching this too. And so this complex set of issues around North Korea's proliferation, not just its missile systems, we worried about them selling technology too, or also transferring technology and purchasing technology, is a very complicated issue. And it gets back to where we began. This is really a China issue. We should think about these arsenals collectively, because in the end, I don't believe there was a meeting between myself and Chairman Kim or between the president and Chairman Kim, where in the 72 hours preceding that, Chairman Kim hadn't spoken or visited physically with Xi Jinping.
Let me ask you a broader question. I know this is going to be an easy one, but I think it's something a lot of Korea experts like myself sort of eventually get to once you've been studying North Korea for so long. It seems like a lot of experts, and there's been a little bit of a turn, I think, in the expert community that says something to the effect that North Korea is probably never going to give up its nuclear weapons. It seems like it would be very difficult, no matter Democrat, Republican administration, to craft the type of incentives that would be necessary for Kim Jong-un to get that same level of security as nuclear weapons. So I guess my question is, could we ever find ourselves in a situation where an American president would say, I'm not going to be able to get them to give up their nuclear weapons, but maybe I'd be able to get them to cap, contain, and perhaps make some sort of pledges to not proliferate those weapons with inspectors, with snap inspections, things of that nature. Do you see that possibility out there?
Never want to rule anything out. I think that's a bad path to go down with a rogue regime like North Korea. I have not yet. What's the right way to put this? Inspections are interesting and important, but never definitive. Whether it was the inspections that were taking place in Iran, we can now see they were cheating. You only look at the nuclear archive material, and now what the dance that the IAEA is engaged in around undeclared nuclear materials in Iran. Inspections are interesting and important, but never definitive. And so I think that would be I recommended to the president, he accepted the thesis that heading down that path with North Korea would be a mistake. We ought to continue to apply the appropriate pressure and incentives to Chairman Kim to say, this is just not worth the candle. Chairman Kim's got challenges too. It's harder to run a hermit kingdom today than it was 20 years ago. So the 25 million people living outside of Pyongyang have literally lived in an information vacuum for their entire lives. That is breaking down. Some of it by pure happenstance and technology, some of it by very intentional efforts from the West to try and feed information in, make sure they get to see that there's this other world out there. I think it's always hard to see, and it was hard to see when we were in the conversation with Chairman Kim too. It's hard to see how you get to the finish line, but it is an effort that is worthy of continuing the undertakings. And as the world begins to unite to confront the Chinese Communist Party, which I believe it is doing even as we sit here today, it will be interesting to see how Chairman Kim's calculus changes as well.
Okay. Let me ask you a little bit of a broader question from one of our fellows, Dr. Matra, who's at the center with us. He asks about the looming Russia-China alliance, if you will, or association. And his question is, what can be done to stop that? Is there any concessions, for example, that could be offered to Moscow? I mean, I think, Mr. Secretary, there's a lot of worry about how far this alliance could go. I mean, even before the Russians and Chinese were as close as they are today, when you saw the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw large amounts of Russian military equipment, scientists go to Beijing. And in fact, I think one can make a very credible argument that the foundations of Chinese military modernization have Russian DNA. When you look at the different fighter jets, other pieces of military equipment, they look very Russian. So is there anything that we can do? You know, a lot of people talk about a reverse Nixon, somehow trying to peel the Russians off from China. What would you say to that?
Yes, I think that's possible. I hinted at that in the paper. I've talked about it a little bit today. It's true that Chinese systems have Russian DNA. You should note they have a lot of American technology too, a lot of American DNA. As well, not procured, and not because American scientists went there, but frankly, to be honest, because a bunch of Chinese scientists came here, and we were fools. We still have 360,000 Chinese students studying in our universities. Pre-COVID, that's the number. 360,000 Chinese students studying at our major universities. Chinese research money flooding our universities. That really doesn't get to your question, but it does get to the naivete of underestimating the Chinese Communist Party will do its best to bring Russia into its orbit. I think that's very clear. If you're China and you're looking for friends, the universe is shrinking and Russia becomes a very powerful ally, a very powerful friend. Second thing that I think about when I think about the Russia-Chinese alliance is temporal. It may well be the case that Xi says, well, for the moment, Russia is going to be my friend, and Putin says, for the moment, it's useful for me as well. But we should never think of that as a static set of relationships. Over time, I think Russia will come to see that if America does the right thing, and if Europe does the right thing, and if we build out the Indo-Pacific Alliance and the Quad in the right way, I think some Russian leader will come to see that the best solution is to at least, if not join the West, be 55%, right? Somewhere if you peg the meter somewhere closer to the West than it is to the East. By the way, there's things that that we were unable to do that I continue to think makes sense. I'll give you an example. If the Indians want to buy some Russian equipment, this may sound as Republican heresy. If the Indians want to buy some Russian equipment, not the end of the world, better than purchasing Chinese equipment, not as good as buying American, but so be it. We shouldn't, right now we've got sanctions that will just rain down on their head. There's technology limits to this. We need to make sure we do it in a way that protects American forces and all the interests that we have. But let Russia's arms dealers make some money. Tie them to the West. We can put some conditions on this in a way that would connect the United States and the West and Russia in important ways. And so as time goes on, not just days and weeks and months and years, but we're going to be at this for a while. There will be a way that Russia can say, no, I need to make sure that I have at least a foot and a significant piece of my torso connected to the West.
Okay. Well, I know we're just about out of time, so I'm going to end this on one last Russia question, I promise. Let us suppose, I don't know, over the weekend, next couple of days, that Vladimir Putin does go into Ukraine in mass. I mean, hard to quantify what that is, but let's say it is a kinetic event where Ukrainian civilians are killed, where there is airstrikes, artillery strikes, et cetera. It is a big deal. If you were Secretary of State, what would you be recommending to, I don't know, let's say it was a second Trump term, if you will. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about kicking the Russians out of SWIFT. Russian scholars and experts call that the nuclear option because of the damage that would do to their economy. What would you recommend?
Certainly economic would be the place to start. SWIFT is complicated, probably makes sense. It's a little simple to talk about being kicked out of SWIFT, but it is the case. You can make it much more difficult for them to conduct commerce in the world. You should know the Chinese would welcome that. So it is not a single-edged sword for sure, but there should be significant economic pain inflicted on Russian leadership. There are ways to do that which impact the Russian people a little bit less, but impact the oligarchs an awful lot. There are many tools in the drawer to do that. We should focus on that. Second, we never forget that the day there's a kinetic event is not the day that the Ukrainian people are no longer relevant. And we should continue to support the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military establishment. We should make it every day there's a Russian weapon system inside of that country. We should make it really costly. We should be convincing Putin this kind of activity can neither be repeated nor continued. And we should work for the day that if he decides to go there and stay, as opposed to, coming in and then pulling everybody back, which I've heard folks talk about. If he comes in and stays, we should make this enormously costly. We, the collective we, not just the United States and Europe. Think about the risk to the Indo-Pacific from having the Russians believe that they can move across boundary. Think to our friends in the Middle East who today are just enormous beneficiaries from the fact that we stopped fracking and investing in American energy. I mean, it's the nuttiest foreign policy thing is to shut down American energy production here in the United States. I literally can find no rationale. I know it's always tucked under the rubric of climate change, but how many coal-fired power plants went online in China today? I don't know, but if not today, tomorrow, certainly this week, they're pumping them out at the tune of one a week. We have this economic lever at our hand that the European nations are dying to ask us to support them with, and we're telling them no, go buy it in the Middle East or go cut a contract with Moscow. It's crazy, given Putin's current activities.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, but during the Trump administration, we were pumping, I think, 13 million barrels of oil per day. So we've fallen somewhere around 11.5. So we've got some room to make up and help those energy prices and help our European allies.
And don't forget natural gas too. We think about barrels per day of oil, important, but don't forget natural gas. The demand is staggering and our capacity to supply it is near infinite.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Mr. Secretary, I promised you a 10:45 hard stop. We are there, sir. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your time. I think this was a very, very productive discussion. I think we made a little bit of news today as well. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank the center staff and all our guests. And with that, I hope everybody has a happy Friday. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary.
So long. Thank you. Bless you all.
Take care.